Thanks, Rachel. Well, the African peace mission to Ukraine has thus far been quite eventful, while President Cyril Ramaphosa remains hopeful that their efforts will bear fruits. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky isn't convinced. Conflict resolution expert Dr Kingsley Makhubela joins me now to discuss these developments. Dr Makhubela, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report. I want to start with the skepticism that we noted in the Ukrainian president yesterday as both heads of state were briefing media. He just did not seem convinced that this peace mission would bear any fruits. Is that a healthy amount of skepticism that one would expect at the start of peace talks of this nature?
Good morning, Douglas. You correctly categorized the day as eventful. Coming out of that press conference, there are certain lessons that we can start to pick up and to start to postulate as to how far the process would go. One is the insistence of the Ukrainians on the two fundamental issues: the respect for territorial integrity and withdrawal of the Russian forces as a precondition for any negotiation, and the continuation of the fight until a final settlement. Those are the two things that he thought he's not going to compromise on them, even though the delegation tried to speak about de-escalation of the conflict, but you could see he's not convinced about that. So taking lessons from yesterday, I think it's going to be a turbulent process moving forward. The Russians will probably have their own preconditions, and it's going to create a stalemate. If the Russians come with their own preconditions, you definitely have a stalemate.
Yeah. Talking about those preconditions that the Ukrainian president was not willing to budge on, I wonder if, this African peace mission will have to start considering, a different approach. I do believe Zelensky said as much as to say that, what is working for us right now is this isolationist approach, applying pressure on Russia by use of sanctions. Do you see the African heads of state acceding to something like that?
It will be very problematic, really, to diplomatically isolate Russia as Zelensky requested. I think he should have urged those who are having more influence on Vladimir Putin to do that, because you need people who have influence on belligerents in any conflict. But you can see Zelensky has set up his mind in what he calls the Global Peace Summit on the Ukraine. And that's where he thinks that a lot of resolution will be taken, isolation of Russia will be taken, more sanctions will be imposed on Russia, and he's courting the Africans to participate in that Global Peace Initiative. I don't know how is it going to work. There are no details about that peace mission. I think the Ukrainians have made up their minds that this African mission, they will listen to them, but they will not agree on the mediation. So there's no, as we are talking, Togozo, there's no agreement on the mediation, that Africa must mediate the conflict.
Yeah.
So we will see what transpires after today's meeting in St. Petersburg with Vladimir Putin. I think they will lock horns in this respect.
Right. When we look at diplomacy, Dr. Makhubela, it's a very interesting, sort of way of life of, I suppose, dealings, right? When we look at the conflict out in Sudan, for instance, the U.S. and Saudi Arabian officials there being forced to come up with a new approach because clearly nothing is working to de-escalate matters there. I wonder if, what we're dealing with here with Zelensky is a head of state who's really kind of made up his mind and is insisting that the only method that's going to work is for other countries to supply Ukraine with arms, to fund his defense of the Ukraine's territorial integrity, and that nothing else really will work in trying to resolve this conflict.
No, in conflict resolution, we always say war is a failure of diplomacy. Once you start to have war, diplomacy has failed. But you can tell the Ukrainians are not keen on any mediation. I mean, they've made it quite clear. The Pope tried to mediate. They refused that. There are a lot of advances to try to mediate the conflict, and Zelensky has refused that. But the fundamental thing that I think the African delegation should have dealt with first is to discuss with those who are funding the Ukrainian conflict, to underwrite any peace process. And the peace process that is not underwritten by the West, it's a problematic thing. Secretary Blinken has made it quite clear that any mediation must deal with those two fundamentals the Ukrainians are raising. So they will not underwrite any peace process before a commitment is made by the Russians to withdraw and for reparation, which is essentially requesting the Russians to capitulate. And the Russians are not in a position to capitulate because they're militarily strong. They keep on producing T-90 tanks. They produce about 100 of them per month. It's huge. So you can see they are preparing the war machine to really go and confront it. So the African mediators are in for a very, very big and delicate process.
Well, they're heading on their second leg of the trip, making their way to St. Petersburg to start conversations there with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Looking at how, conversations and talks went with Zelensky, would you say that, this peace mission is already limping into its second leg?
It's actually not limping. It's on a wrong track of derailment, totally. Because yesterday, President Putin made it quite clear that anyone who supplies the F-16 to Ukraine, he would destroy them immediately. But if these F-16s were to operate from a neighboring country and take off from a neighboring country, he would attack this F-16 from that neighboring country. So you can see the stakes are very high in terms of this, and the war rhetoric it's accentuated on both sides. So I really don't see any success coming up from this mission. The only success that we can talk about is the fact that they've agreed to listen to the African delegation, and that's it. And I don't think there will be any way forward in terms of that, even though Zelensky made it quite clear that he's willing to engage with this group of African states moving forward. But he's looking at that in terms of the Ukraine-Africa summit, which mirrors what exists currently, the Russia-Africa summit. He's thinking of having a similar platform. And that platform will not necessarily deal with the mediation. It's a platform that is going to deal with mobilizing the isolation of Russia and imposing further sanctions from Russia. I mean, Ndogozo, also, the delegation, I heard them speaking about the grain and fertilizers, and you could tell Zelensky took an umbrage at that because he said this war has gone beyond that, and you could see the change of tone, and rightfully so. You can't go there and want to discuss how do we get our bread when people are being killed, asking them to keep on supplying you with their bread. It's being insensitive to raise those issues. The first issue must be to resolve the conflict, and then the logistics will start to flow out of that. But they need to go to a conflict area, and once you speak about your fertilizers and bread, when people are dying in that country and say, let them keep on supplying us with bread and fertilizers, I think it was basically insensitive. And I see the same narrative in the media, particularly the South African media. They've turned this the mission of peace and grain. It can't be phrased in this manner. It raises serious problems.
Right. Well, we've discussed, I suppose the futility of diplomacy at this point, given the fact that these two countries are, in fact, at war with one another. So clearly talks have failed to prevent, the conflict from erupting. We are where we are now. The point is, globally, as an order, we are trying to have some sort of de-escalation happen in that Eastern European region. What does that look like, given the fact that we have these two countries who have their very strict preconditions? It's also been discussed and been labeled as a war of proxy. So we have all these other nations in established global orders having their say, putting up their support, aligning themselves with either side of this conflict, further escalating matters. What does a de-escalation look like at this point?
De-escalation would not work under the current global circumstances. Yesterday, the U.S. landed their submarine, their nuclear submarine in South Korea. Further, really putting pressure on the global system. So the tension is building up in terms of the military deployment. The NATO, they've had their military exercises, the biggest military exercises last week. So you can see there's no intention, there are no exercises to de-escalate the conflict. And I think de-escalation would only work if the United States and Europe agreed that there's a need to de-escalate the conflict and start a direct dialogue with the Russians. So there's no dialogue between the US and Russia. There's no dialogue between Europe and Russia. So the tension is building up, and they are all posturing for a conflict and setting up for that. So that's where the challenge is. We need to first convince those who are funding the Ukrainian conflict to agree on the de-escalation and have negotiations with the Russians about de-escalation. But de-escalation must provide benefits to both disputants in this regard. And what are those benefits? The Russians are looking at lifting of sanctions and allowing certain things. So there's a whole package that must be put in place. And I don't think Ukraine is capable of doing that on its own now.
Right. Dr. Makhubela, thank you so much for joining us and for coming onto the program and sharing your insights with us. That was conflict resolution expert Dr. Kingsley Makhubela joining us to discuss developments taking place with that AU peace mission.